I think you could make the case for both yes and no here, but at the end of the day, Nintendo has been marching to the beat of their own drum for the past 20 years, just about. The GameCube was the last time that Nintendo really tried to compete against the other two consoles with the PlayStation and the Xbox. And, the discs were too small and they couldn't fit the whole game on them, so you had a lot of kind of hamstrung versions of games, and because of that, people bought the GameCube for first-party stuff, and thankfully for Nintendo, their first-party stuff is amazing, so people still think of the GameCube fondly. But, it didn't compete against the PS2, which was far and away the most successful console in that generation, which left Nintendo in a place where they were like, let's just do our own thing. And that's when you get the Nintendo Wii, and the Wii was obviously hugely successful. I feel like the conversation about that generation in particular is what was the best-selling console? It was the Wii, but then the other conversation is okay, but between the Xbox 360 and the PS3, which was the best-selling console, but the Wii was the winner there, and most of that was due to the fact that Nintendo didn't feel the need to compete against the other two consoles. They just had their own thing going on, and it really worked for them. The reason I'm bringing this up is because what happened after the Wii is maybe the best analog for what's happening right now. After the Wii, we got the Wii U, and Nintendo launched the Wii U by saying, this is a competitor to the other two consoles. This is, a follow-up to the Wii, but it is also powerful enough to play AAA games from other third-party developers. And you got games like Batman and like Mass Effect, and Ubisoft made a thing called Zombie U, and you also got the first-party stuff. And look, shouldn't that be a success? The answer was no. The Wii U was not powerful enough to compete against the upcoming Xbox One generation and the PS4 generation, and kind of got left in the dust immediately because as that continued to flounder, the 3DS continued to succeed. And when you're Nintendo and you're looking at these two consoles, you have to ask yourself, which one do you invest money in? The 3DS, obviously, and the 3DS went on to be hugely successful once again. But that moment there where Nintendo looked at the success of the Wii and said, now it's time to compete again because we have this amazing cultural cachet and this amazing industry cachet. That's what's happening again with the Switch 2. The question is, have they earned that? And can they pull it off this time? I think we have to start by acknowledging how successful the Switch has been. I think even on a company level, deciding to merge the handheld and the console game development houses together, meaning that there's just a constant flood of first-party stuff, was obviously an incredible move and totally solves the Wii U or 3DS problem, because then you're not deciding either or, you're deciding it's just the Switch. On top of that, they started to kind of improve their developer relations and get more third-party support. And also, the Switch, just by virtue of it being this kind of nice, cozy thing that you can hold in your bed or on a couch and then also dock, became an obvious home for a lot of indie games. So it became the PC and the Switch were the two consoles or the two things that you made your games for if you're an indie developer. The Switch sold gangbusters, and Nintendo is now in another position where they're what do we do next? How do we go bigger and better and bolder? And one option is to do something totally unlike the Switch and jump to something like the Wii again and say, what is the super weird future of video games? And they could chase that. Or they could do the thing that everybody just wanted them to do, which is make a bigger, better Switch, something that outputs at 4K, something that has, a moderately more interesting control input, or something kind of Nintendo-y and fun and weird, which we got in mouse control, and then honestly, maybe also the camera, but, how much do I really care about getting iToy again? I already had it on the PS2, and I was not very thrilled with it then. I don't know if I need it again in 2025, personally. But I think the thing that really stands out to me is that if you go back and you watch that Direct again with this in mind, you might agree, but it feels to me like Nintendo is really positioning the Switch 2 directly against the PS5 and the Xbox series of consoles. You could start even at the highest level by just saying the price that they announced, which is, we'll see if that's the price in the US. We'll also see if we can pre-order it at all in the US. But the price that they announced right after that Direct was $449. You compare that to the prices of the PS5 Slim, for example, or the Xbox Series X digital edition that doesn't have the disc drive. Those consoles are going for $350, $400, $450. That kind of the exact same price. Even just on that level, Nintendo has already abandoned what they usually do, their usual MO, which is slightly less powerful hardware, but also it's a Nintendo console. So you're going to get all the first party stuff that you wouldn't have gotten elsewhere. And it is the obvious choice for like parents buying a console for their kids. But even outside of just the price, I feel like the games that they showed in that direct really indicate what Nintendo thinks they're doing here. The Nintendo Switch was a lot of people's first consoles. I think for kids who were growing up with the Nintendo Switch, they were like, this is my first console. I love it so much. It's my favorite thing. But as they got older, over the past 7 years of the Nintendo Switch, they're probably like, this thing is for kids a little bit. And Nintendo showing up in the Switch 2 Direct saying, here's the Switch 2. It has Cyberpunk. It has Elden Ring. It has Yakuza 0 Director's Cut. It has a new game by FromSoft called Duskbloods. It indicates that the Switch 2 is growing up, that the Nintendo Switch as a brand is growing up. So you're pricing it against the other consoles. You have the same games as the other consoles, very similar to what they did with the Wii U. But in this case, the Nintendo Switch was so successful that it feels like that positioning by itself might work out. I'm thinking specifically about when the Nintendo Switch first came out. And those early third-party games did unbelievably well. Things like Golf Story really took off and, propelled that developer into kind of indie stardom pretty quickly. A lot of these games became like tentpole Nintendo Switch games just because they were there early. On top of that, you also got all that first-party stuff. But I think more specifically, those first couple months of the Switch 1 really proved to a lot of other companies, if you support this console specifically, you will sell a lot of units and it will be worth the investment. So Nintendo showing up at this direct saying, you're still getting all the stuff you loved about the original Switch. There's still going to be a Mario Kart. It's a whole new Mario Kart. There are still going to be indie games. We saw Hades 2 from Supergiant showed up there, and that's apparently going to be a Nintendo Switch 2 and Nintendo Switch 1 console exclusive at launch, timed exclusive, but it'll be there, which is nice. A Silk Song showed up again for about 8 seconds. The indie games that you know and love from the Nintendo Switch will still exist and still show up on the Switch 2. You're still going to get all that first-party stuff. And also, on top of all of that, developers like FromSoft and CD Projekt Red and all of these other developers are starting to show up in full force and support it on a deeper level than they did before. The kinds of games that you couldn't believe could run on the Steam Deck are now running on the Nintendo Switch 2. And that's an exciting prospect. That's pretty cool positioning, I think. All this to say, Nintendo is in a really great position because they already proved out over the last 7 years that this model works. And if other people show up, it'll continue to work. They just need people to buy the Nintendo Switch 2, which is dicey at best. At the moment, is how I'd put it, considering all the pricing stuff. But as long as people buy the Switch 2, their plan will work out. Even branching outside of video games, this confidence that Nintendo has right now is everywhere. They have realized that their intellectual property is so huge and so vastly important to them as a brand that it can buoy up entire other enterprises. They have theme parks in different continents. They have movies being made. And they released an app that's a calendar that's just ads for their own stuff, and people downloaded it and put it on their home screen. You don't make an app like Nintendo today unless you are extremely confident that people are going to want to engage with your stuff as a lifestyle brand and not just as a video game company. And I think they're managing to make that transition pretty well for the most part. No one's really batting an eye at Nintendo doing all of this stuff. They're kind of positioning themselves as a Disney in a way, and that's a huge shift. But it's also one that you make when you are, really sure of yourself. You really know that you're going to nail it, and so far they have for the most part. But the flip of confidence, of course, is overconfidence, and there's this case to be made about the hubris of Nintendo right now. And I think a lot of that actually starts with the pricing, right? A lot of that starts with the fact that, first of all, they didn't show the price in the Nintendo Direct because they either were embarrassed by what the price was going to be, or they were Nintendo is so great that the price won't even matter. People will show up and buy it in, the millions and millions and millions of units no matter what. I don't think that that's true, if I'm being totally honest. I don't know if that's true, especially when the games are as expensive as they are. But even beyond the price, Nintendo was, again, withholding a lot of information about the Switch 2, and a lot of that came from a company that is overconfident in their own ability to message information. What they were doing in that direct was standing on top of a mountain, holding up the 10 Commandments, being like, guess what? This is the Switch 2. Isn't it sick? And, they couldn't hear the people down below asking questions, and they didn't care about the people down below asking questions. It didn't matter to them if people were confused because they got their message across. And it really wasn't until there was a lot of blowback. For example, all of the people saying drop the price over and over and over again for 4 straight hours in their Treehouse live stream, where I think internally you start to think, we have a problem here. We did not message this correctly. There is this vitriol being thrown at the company because we weren't able to get our point across. We weren't able to explain the $450 price in a way that worked for people. The irony, of course, is that at least in the US, the price is probably going to be like $500, $600 because of the nightmare of tariffs. But you have to look back and say that was a PR disaster for Nintendo to not release the price and to have people get sticker shock after the fact. And I'll say this as somebody who is coming off of 7 years of working for the Walt Disney Company, specifically in marketing and working with PR teams and stuff. They must have been losing their minds internally trying to figure out what went wrong here. I think, go watch the Kit and Krista episode all about this. I think, as two people who also worked in PR, specifically, more importantly, for Nintendo PR, they have a really good insight into hey, Nintendo hasn't flexed this muscle where they need to do damage control in a long time, and they don't even really know who to put on the pedestal to do so. We're seeing as of this week, Bill Trinan and Doug Bowser start to give interviews that are trying to clarify things, explaining why Mario Kart World is $80. But still, that's a thing they haven't needed to do for a long time because the Switch was such a huge success that people weren't rallying against Nintendo as a corporation all the time the way they were during that Treehouse stream. The place where I do think Nintendo is really overstepping, though, in terms of competing with the Xbox and the PlayStation, is more so that they're trying to compete with the PC. And I just I don't think that's a good move, realistically. The Steam Deck is successful, or at least more successful than you would think for such a niche kind of device, right? The Steam Deck has sold 4 million units estimated, and that's great for the Steam Deck, but does not hurt the bottom line of any of these companies, really. But it is interesting, and I think Nintendo building mouse mode into the Switch 2 feels more like a shot across the bow of the PC as an ecosystem than at the Steam Deck specifically. And I think what that means is that Nintendo is expecting developers to develop their indie games that are mouse and keyboard only for the Nintendo Switch 2 as well, and saying people can use mouse mode. A game like Civilization 7, for example, I know not an indie game, but Civ 7 or Civilization as a franchise is a franchise that is mostly well known for being just a game you use the mouse and you click around and you do stuff. And you hit end turn until you're supposed to go to sleep, and then you keep hitting end turn anyway. And that game is going to show up on the Switch 2, confirmed with mouse control. And I feel like that is kind of a proof of concept for about 1 million other PC games. Since 2021, console game purchases have been mostly stagnant, and PC game purchases have increased by 20% in that same interval. And what Nintendo is trying to do here is to boost the console game sell-through number by introducing into their console the same method of input that you use on PC, which is an interesting and roundabout thing to do here. But what they're really not counting is the legacy of the Steam library. Speaking from my own personal experience, I have ended this generation. I know this generation is not over yet, technically, with the PS5 and the Xbox and whatever, but if we're calling the Switch 1 or the end of the Switch 1 the end of this generation, I'm ending this generation purchasing most games on PC and really only buying first-party stuff for Nintendo from now on. And that was not the case for most of the Switch's life cycle, to be clear. I would consider myself to be mostly a console gamer, but still there's this certain feeling that I have of at any moment, one of these companies can release a new console and say it's not backwards compatible, and then all of those purchases go away. Versus something like Steam, where all of those games are still available. They're available well into the future. And it's really just on the onus of the developer to continue to update it for the future, and less so on will this hardware support this old game, yes or no. Going into the Nintendo Switch 2, you have a double problem here of I don't trust Nintendo to make the next Nintendo Switch backwards compatible. I just don't. It's cool that they did it this time, but I don't know if they'll do it next time. And also, the games are too expensive. Any game a Yakuza 0, for example, it's cool that there's director's cut content on the Switch 2 version. I'm just going to get the one that's in a bundle that's the same price for PC. You know, you can get every Yakuza game for like $40 on sale all the time, like 8 times a year, the entire franchise goes on sale. Or you can buy Yakuza 0 Director's Cut. It just doesn't make sense to do that. It doesn't make sense to buy it on the Switch too. We already live in a world where people buy like one game a year. You know, they buy their like FIFA or their Call of Duty or whatever. Those games will be on the Switch too, and that's cool. But if Nintendo has now changed the pricing landscape of the entire industry where everyone feels suddenly compelled to charge $70 or $80 for whatever game that is they're making. You suddenly go from a place where people are buying one game a year to people are buying maybe like not even one game a year. Like on average, how many games do you buy a year? Like it might end up being like 0.9 games a year or something. I imagine if you're watching this video, you're not one of those people. I imagine you are pretty tapped in. You probably own multiple consoles. You probably buy a bunch of games every year, et cetera, et cetera. But Nintendo is not just trying to appeal to the people like you and me. They're trying to appeal to everyone as widely as they possibly can. And I think raising prices across the board and trying to compete specifically against Steam is like, you can't really beat Steam. I mean, look at all of the companies who have tried to beat Steam on the PC, right? Microsoft has tried, Epic Games is trying by just giving free games away as quickly and as voraciously as they possibly can. And even still, it's like Steam is the default for everybody when they get a PC and they want to play games on it. With the exception of things that are exclusive to the Nintendo Switch 2 or like timed exclusives or whatever, I will probably be buying most stuff on PC. And one of the funny things too about a game like Hades, for example, Hades 2, when that launches out of early access, again, that's going to be a timed console exclusive on the Nintendo Switch and the Nintendo Switch 2. What is my ROG Ally X if not just like a beefier Nintendo Switch? That is a console as much as the Nintendo Switch 2 is, but because it has access to Steam, it means I get Hades 2 on it at launch also. I think if you put all this together, you have a console that is too expensive. You have a company that is supporting the previous generation anyway, right? Like there's a bunch of games coming out for the Nintendo Switch 1 over the next year, which they announced in the Nintendo Direct before this one. You have games that are too expensive, and you have a lack of people wanting to buy console games in the first place in favor of buying PC games. And it leads me down this path of like, is the Nintendo Switch 2 just a thing that you wait a couple of years for and then buy later? It feels so much like the PS3 in that way, where the PS3 launched at way too expensive of a price point. And then eventually, over time, they built up that library, they dropped the price. You got a thing like the PS3 Slim, and then suddenly the PS3 was worth buying because you could get the thing cheap, and all the games were like PlayStation Hits editions. They were all cheap as well. And for those of you at home saying like Nintendo doesn't do that, they don't do sales on their games, they only will drop the price if there's hardware revisions, etc. You're not wrong in that there is not a lot of precedent for Nintendo doing that. Like they do sales, but they're not really like huge sales. But also, look at the 3DS. I think the 3DS is maybe the best analog to what's going on here, where in March of 2011, Nintendo launched the 3DS at $250. By July of that year, it had moved under 1 million units, and immediately Nintendo dropped the price to $170. Satoru Iwata, who was the president at the time, rest in peace, took a pay cut. The other Nintendo executives around his tier also took a pay cut to try and subsidize the 3DS for everybody else globally. And they wanted to get it back on track, and they did, and the 3DS became successful long-term, obviously. I feel like there's a world in which something like that happens with the Nintendo Switch 2. We're already seeing them sell it for around $330 in Japan for a region-locked exclusive version in Japan, which does raise some questions about where the margins are here for the Switch 2, and maybe they have more wiggle room than we thought. You know, again, the tariff nightmare means that all of this stuff in terms of pricing is up in the air. But I think from a larger strategy perspective, Nintendo is really trying to position themselves against all these other consoles. And it's worth mentioning also that the tariffs that Trump has imposed don't just affect the Switch 2. Like when the PS5 and the Xbox Series X sell out in your local Walmart and they need to get more shipped in from elsewhere, guess who's paying for those tariffs, baby? I guess to answer the question that I titled this video, has Nintendo earned this confidence? I think they have in certain respects. I think they have in certain ideas that they have about how they're going to win the Nintendo Switch 2 generation. You know, I think that they are in a position where they can compete with those other consoles, and it makes sense for them to do so. Where I think they really overstep is in trying to take on Steam and PC in the process. I think that's too difficult of a fight to win. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you so much for doing that. If this is your first time here, also really thank you for doing that. Please maybe consider subscribing. I have a lot of videos that are going to be coming out soon about weird stuff, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, I'll talk to you later, everybody. I'll be back. You'll be back. I'll be back. You know, we'll hang out again.